It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Pierce, and welcome back to my conversation with Richard Sakwa about deteriorating U.S.-Russia relations. Richard Sakwa is professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent and an associate fellow of the Russia-Eurasia program at Chatham House. His upcoming book is titled Russia Against the Rest: Pluralism and Post-Cold War Crisis of World Order. Richard, good to have you back.
Hello.
So, Richard, in segment one, we discussed a key important benchmark that sunk relations with Russia related to the DNC hacking, which really aggravated the Democratic Party and President Obama in particular. But with this administration, meaning the Trump administration, we were to advance relations. What has happened here? How has this crisis escalated instead of de-escalating?
Yes, one of the few salutary things about a Trump presidency, according to many West Europeans, was the thought that he may improve relations with Russia, because a new US president, a new leader, often is an opportunity to reset, to rethink relations. And certainly when Trump was saying it makes sense to have good relations with Russia, there was an expectation that things would not at least get worse. And in fact, of course, they have done, because no one expected the ferocity of the counter-attack, if you like, against the Trumpian definition of the US role in the world. As I have been arguing, that he shifts the emphasis. If all American leaders, congressional and executive, believe in US primacy, he shifts the terrain away from a certain definition of leadership that is based on multilateral relations, good bilateral links with other countries, and so on, and a defense of public goods like the Paris Climate Change Accord of December 2015. Instead of that, Trump shifts the emphasis to American greatness, not leadership, greatness. And that's a rather different formula, and one with which Russia, China, and other countries can deal with, because that means the normalization of US foreign policy. No longer does it claim to be exceptional, apart from in its power. No longer does it claim to be the leader of the world. It's just one other power looking after its interests. So that looked as if it was going to provide an opening for normal diplomatic great power relations. Instead of which, we see the way that the United States establishment, if you like, has fought back. The globalists have formed an alliance between the liberal internationalists and the neocons, the neoconservatives, to fight against Trump's shift in US policy. And they've been using Russia as a stick with which to beat him. So that's the context. That's why things have got so bad. And of course, then you start looking about all of those accusations at the moment of hacking and all the rest. In fact, there's 5 things going on simultaneously in Washington at the moment. And I must say, it leaves most of the rest of the world rather bemused about what's going on, quite apart from the shenanigans within the Trump administration itself. So I'll just very briefly, I'll just simply say that the first thing, obviously, is the accusation of collusion, that in one way or another, Russia was working with Trump to get him elected. It's called hacking the election and so on. I am very dismissive of this. So far, there's no substantive evidence. The only serious document about collusion is this Christopher Steele document published in BuzzFeed on the 11th of January, which actually was just a collection of gossip and nothing, and plenty of contradictions and mistakes. We can talk about collusion again, if you like. The second issue, just very briefly, is the so-called hacking. Now, enormous amount of evidence suggests that there wasn't a hack. It was a leak from the DNC. Well, still, it's very odd that the FBI did not do its own independent analysis of the DNC server, instead of which they called in a body called CrowdStrike, headed by Dmitry Alpirovich, who is a well-known Putin critic. And the way that he suggested that the malware used for this was the same as used in Ukraine and so on, it simply doesn't make sense. So the hacking question, even James Comey effectively admitted as much. And the so-called report of 17 US intelligence agencies published on the 6th of January 2017 also suggests that there was not much there. So that's the hacking. Again, it's a big issue. We can't go into detail. The third thing is this: the so-called, in response to all the accusations, unfounded as they are, the accusation of a cover-up, and so clearly there's been this ferocity with which they're trying to find any possible contact with a former Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, and all of that. I don't think there's anything in that either. There's the contacts were normal and they've been misrepresented overwhelmingly in the U.S. press. I think the Washington Post and New York Times have been absolutely disgraceful in the coverage of it. The Wall Street Journal rather better in suggesting collusion, in fact, and they've been misrepresenting conversations. Again, a big issue. The fourth thing is, that's quite interesting, is the way that the intelligence community has been leaking information, which I think is unbelievable. Some of these leaks, so the real leak is the intelligence agencies in the United States leaking against Donald Trump. And I think it's absolutely disgraceful. It's a sign that they're becoming politicized, and that's a really worrying sign for the quality of U.S. Democracy. So, and then of course there's the the various issues going on within the administration itself, but we won't need to go into that.
Right, Richard, you are here dismissing the Trump campaign collusion with Russia. And while the points you make are important, how do you explain the basic dishonesty, hiding meetings that took place with various members of the Trump campaign and Kislyak, the ambassador from Russia, and Trump campaign personnel like Trump Jr. Meeting with Russian advocates, let's say, under the best case scenario, and Jared Kushner's meetings with Russian oligarchs. Why weren't they just honest about it and say these things took place, and yes, these meetings happened, but they had to be drawn out of them, which appear to have some implications are that they are trying to hide something.
Well, again, I think that these meetings turned out, if you look at each one of them, they've been grotesquely misrepresented in the US press. For example, the one on the 9th of June between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and of course, Natalia Veselnitskaya, the Russian lawyer, that ultimately it was not important. So, if you started looking at any politician, they would forget a lot of these things. A lot of these meetings, the Kislyak, Michael Flynn conversation at the end of December when Flynn was on holiday. Again, if you look at the transcript about when he was asked, did you discuss the lifting of sanctions? And Flynn quite accurately and honestly said, no, we didn't. Then it was misrepresented as if he denied the actual conversation. He denied an aspect of the conversation. He was correct to do so. In my view, Trump should never have sacked Flynn. There's plenty of downsides about Flynn, but the fact of collusion, the idea that in some way or another Kislyak or the Russians could have ability to blackmail him because he hid the content of the conversation, it becomes one absurdity piled upon another. So yes, the Trump administration, we all know, is relatively dysfunctional. So clearly there's plenty of things going on. But one thing which I think really should be stressed in all of this is the actual, and this over the years, this will come out, is the malevolence of the Clinton campaign. The fact that they've been hiding so much. They were the ones who hired, don't forget, Christopher Steele, after he'd started his investigations on behalf of Trump's Republican rival. They were colluding with a foreign individual. So if anybody was colluding, it was the Clintons. And also the day after the election, 9th of November 2016, is becoming clear now that the Clintonians and Hillary Clinton herself simply could not accept that her loss in the election was due to her own inadequacies, instead of which they decided to blame Russia. And this is an extraordinarily dangerous game, and it's leading us into a very dangerous new Cold War with a nuclear power. And Russia's response, in many ways, has been remarkably mild in this context.
Right. Lastly, Richard, why is Russia so confrontational with the U.S. when they have been so measured, when President Putin himself has been so somewhat ridiculing the overreaction on the part of the U.S. diplomats? But this time around, he is not taking the high ground, and he is imposing these sanctions, as you say, draconian. Why are they not more like China, for example, who continue to build their economy, build their military, pursue a non-confrontational foreign policy with the U.S.? These countermeasures and the sanctions are escalating tensions between two superpowers. And why are they doing this now?
Yes, no, I think that's a fundamental question, is to understand the dynamic of Russian actions. And I wish more US commentators actually posed that question. How can we explain Russian behavior rather than simply assuming that Putin is a madman, a devil in human form, and so on? He's not. In fact, Putin is perhaps the most pro-Western Russian leader that the country has ever had. And in the years 2000 to 2012, he desperately tried to find a way in which they could work well with Washington. Obama was simply incapable of listening to Russian concerns. He had nothing but contempt for Putin personally. It came out the dreadful misstep in appointing Michael McFaul, who is not a diplomat, he's an ideologue. And so it went, of course, with the Libyan crisis. By 2012, when Putin came back, he decided that the United States was nedogovorspособная, meaning it's undealable with. You can't really talk to these people. And in all the years since the end of the Cold War, simply never did the United States and the Western powers take into account Russian concerns. Instead of which, you had NATO enlargement. Just this year, Montenegro, of all countries, Montenegro joined NATO, which doesn't add to its security, but a sense in which Russia is surrounded. Then, of course, the Ukrainian events, the huge fear that Sevastopol, the major base, would fall into American hands. So the option of a quiet rise, which the Chinese pursued for many years under Deng Xiaoping and his early successors, simply was not an option. China is not being surrounded in quite the same way as Russia is, with NATO and with its Atlantic system and this constant propaganda pressure, which is delegitimizing Russia. It's got many governance problems, no one denies it. But it's not our part to tell a country how to run its own affairs. Incidentally, China is no longer being quite so quiet as it was. With Obama, in fact, Hillary Clinton's disastrous pivot to Asia, which was basically a declaration of containment of China. China is fighting back. It's concerned about the 600 US bases surrounding it. New one developed much more in Darwin in Australia. And this is why China in the South China Sea is saying that it's actually going to start pushing back against this endless pressure from irresponsible military elites in the United States. Even to the point now we're joking that perhaps Russia and China, who had some military naval exercises in the Baltic Sea a few days ago, maybe would see how the United States would like it if Russia and China sent their navy into the Gulf of Mexico and talked about a freedom of navigation mission. I don't think the US would like it, and just like other countries don't either. So it's time for all countries to step back. Above all, the Clintonians and those opposed to Trump. They've done everything to block his ability to establish solid working relations with Russia. There's so many issues to deal with: North Korea, Syria, Ukraine, many others. They really have to work together. So it's really, the big question is, how can we explain the Clintonians in alliance with the anti-Trump Republicans, above all people like John McCain, and the irresponsibility of how irresponsible that alliance is in blocking Trump's possibly his only seriously good policy, and that is to normalize relations with Moscow.
And Richard, finally, one other unique feature about the Russian situation is, of course, the encirclement of Russia and the proximity of that encirclement in relation to NATO. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Absolutely. As we know, Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO, which even the Europeans said that was a step too far. Because if NATO came into Ukraine, at the closest point, it's about 400 kilometers to Moscow. So imagine if we had a major military alliance just down in the southern tip of Virginia, the state of Virginia, vis-a-vis Washington. It's just absurd. It's so absurd that all those who endlessly talk about the freedom of choice of Ukraine and other countries to join any military alliance that they want to, it's just crazy. If, for example, Mexico wanted to join Russia and China and so on as emerging anti-hegemonic alliance, I think the United States would have something to say about it. Clearly, some attempts were made to negotiate the enlargement. Yes, we know that. But this was, as, for example, the NATO-Russia Council, which is, of course, never convened when it's needed. And so Russia, in terms of security, is arguing that it's always invited to the hors d'oeuvre and never to the dinner, always kept on the outside. So we've got a security dilemma of the worst order. And that, I think, is the deep wellspring of the logic. In 25 years, we simply haven't dealt with the root. And it's turned Russia, which would have been a huge ally to work with the West, into a more and more angry potential enemy.
Let's leave you for now, but there are so many more discussions to be had in terms of U.S.-Russia relations, and I hope to have you back very soon to pursue those.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.